Well, hello again, Bravites, and welcome to another edition of Movie Reviews with yours truly, Toya. And on today, I will be reviewing the movie It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, which stars Tom Hanks and covers Mr. Fred Rogers, who we all grew up with. You know Mr. Rogers if you watched The Magic School Bus, Lamb Chops in My Generation, Sesame Street, The Reading Rainbow, then certainly Mr. Rogers was part of your childhood TV programming. And so you were excited to go out and watch this movie because it made you feel nostalgic. It brought back a flood of emotions and memories that you probably haven't thought about in years. But like I said, Mr. Rogers would use cute little anecdotes and stories and tales and puppets and things like that to get children to understand life and kind of give them a perspective that comes down to their level, where they can understand what's going on around them. And in this movie, we saw Mr. Rogers talking to a man in the movie by the name of Lloyd. And Lloyd was his friend that a story was built around to kind of make you introspective, to give you a perspective to look at your own life and get things and the decisions that you're making and kind of get things in order before it's too late. Luckily, in this movie, Lloyd was able to do that and everything came together beautifully. But more than that, I want to talk about how the sets were rebuilt. It was reflective of how Mr. Rogers' sets were, where you would see a toy neighborhood, you would see claymation, you would see puppets, you saw your friends. King Friday the 13th was in the movie. The puppet, the classic puppet that Mr. Rogers used on his show. You had the cat Daniel Tiger. You had Lady Elaine. You had the mailman with his speedy delivery and that classic line that he would use, and all of those things. And it was just beautiful and fun to watch. And it was so much fun to sing the intro and outro to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And so you remember the classic song? It's such a good feeling to know you're alive. It's such a happy feeling you're growing inside. And when you wake up ready to say, I think I'll make a snappy new day. It's such a good, you remember those lyrics and you didn't even know that you still knew those lyrics. I was looking forward to Mr. Rogers throwing one shoe from one hand to the other as he was getting ready to go home. All of those things. It was just so beautiful to look back on. But in this movie, you saw a character, once again, his name was Lloyd, and he was a writer for a magazine, and he wanted his career to take off in a different direction, and they put him on the story of Mr. Rogers, which originally was supposed to be a 400-word essay in a magazine, and Lloyd, being who he was, just could not deal with that, and so he was used to doing big exposés that would give him a name and some credibility, and so Lloyd in the movie does this. He goes after Mr. Rogers with both barrels blazing, with both hands and feet, and he just wants to dig in and get to know all that he can and can all that he knows. And, Lloyd was a cynic. He was somebody that, life had dealt a few bad hands, and he just wasn't in tune with everything that was going on around him. He just kind of wanted to do what he had to do and get through it. And when he came into contact with Mr. Rogers with his calm demeanor and his loving spirit and his gentleness and his generosity, all of those things came rushing at Lloyd, and he couldn't help but fall victim to Mr. Rogers' loving kindness the way all of us did as a child. And so Lloyd learned so much from Mr. Rogers, and he found that he needed him and his guidance in his life. And we saw Mr. Rogers in the movie talking to Lloyd about how sometimes you feel deepness and deep darkness, and you don't know how to really express it. And so Mr. Rogers would say he would play like the lowest keys on the piano, was like boom, and that's the way he would express the darkness that he was feeling. And his wife went on to tell Lloyd, sometimes he prays for people by name, and he's always done that. He goes for a swim, he does these different things to cleanse his spirit and to clear his mind. And I look at people like Mr. Rogers as tortured souls or tormented souls and bleeding hearts, because they work with children, because children have this purity about them and this innocence about them that, the world has not corrupted them yet. And it's just a joy to be around children, because you have this pure love from a pure place, and it's something that is just beautiful to experience and watch. But you know that you also have to protect them because the real world is out there and it can and will eat them alive. And so Mr. Rogers was one of those people that appreciated the love and the purity and the innocence of children, but he was also afraid for what could come their way. And so you would look at him and he poured all of this out to millions. People today, even 30, 40, 50 years after he's gone off of the scene, he's not on TV anymore, but we still remember his impact on our lives. And it was just a beautiful thing to watch that movie come together and make the story unfold in a way that you saw an adult benefit from Mr. Rogers and his puppets and his childlike innocence in the same way that we did when we were children. Now, Tom Hanks is a legend in his own right. You've seen him do movies like Forrest Gump, which really put him on the map. He's a phenomenal actor. And I venture to say, you know, they went ahead and said that Mr. Rogers and Tom Hanks were cousins, third or fifth cousins or something, I believe. I didn't need that tidbit of information. I knew I was going to see this movie before they put that out there. That was not necessary for me. But you can look at Tom Hanks and how he channeled the character of Mr. Rogers. He spoke slowly. He talked gently. He was very patient and very understanding and very kind and pulled things out of you that you didn't even know were in there. Hidden darkness, hidden things that you just don't want to deal with. He was able to pull them out gently, make you deal with them, and then, you know, make you rebuild yourself to be a better you. And I just think that was beautiful to watch. I look at Tom Hanks playing Mr. Rogers like I look at, okay, that's the real Ike and Tina. Ike and Tina Turner are not the real Ike and Tina. These people play the role so well that I can't even see the real people for who they are. And that's how I feel about Mr. Rogers. I look at Tom Hanks and I'm like, that's Mr. Rogers. You nailed it. He absolutely nailed it. And I just thought he did a really great job at expressing that. But I say that he was a bleeding heart and a tormented soul because, you know, once everyone was gone off of the set, because it was just a job for them, but it was a lifestyle. It was a need for Mr. Rogers to be there for people, to show kindness to children who were sick and ailing, who people didn't want to take time out for. He stopped taping on his show just to show a child that he really cared about what he was going through and his situation. And, you know, once everybody left the set at the end of the movie, they shut off all of the lights. They left Mr. Rogers in the studio playing the piano, and he could play beautifully. They had one scene, he and his wife were playing together, and it was just really beautiful to watch. But at the end of the movie, Mr. Rogers hits that low tone on the piano and kind of just boom, like he says in the movie. He lays on those keys for a moment. And then he goes back to Twinkling the Ivories, which shows that there was a darkness in him that he just never really conquered himself. So he helped other people over their hurdles and issues in life, but he still had this darkness that he didn't know how to deal with. His own son in the movie, he said, didn't really acknowledge that he was his father. He had only recently begun to tell people that Mr. Rogers was his father, and he had his own issues to deal with, and he stepped away from the TV show for 3 years to deal with what he had been dealing with his sons, as you know, in their adolescent years up to their teenage years, until they could get that together and kind of get smooth sailing going at home. And then he went back to being Mr. Rogers for the world. So his giftings to the world, his sainthood, as they refer to in the movie, is definitely solidified. He was a beautiful person, and it was a beautiful movie. It was a wonderful way to roll out and flesh out who Mr. Rogers was and show today's generation just how much he meant to the world and how much he impacted the world. I thought it was very interesting the way that they would use old footage in the movie, and they would either crop Tom Hanks into the scenes to actually be playing Mr. Rogers at that time. So it would be interesting to actually watch the interview of Mr. Rogers on the Oprah Winfrey Show versus Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers on the Oprah Winfrey Show. It would be very interesting to see how they even put Tom Hanks in the seat of Mr. Rogers as he entertained a stringed quartet. I don't know if it was quartet, but there was a women's group that played stringed instruments, and it was old footage that they used in the movie. You could tell that it wasn't new actors that they brought in to play those roles, but it was actually the old footage that they had put Tom Hanks into. And it was just really wonderful to watch. The cinematography, everything came together wonderfully. The storyline, I have not spoiled it for you, if if you can believe that or not. It came together so well, and it just helped you look at life in a different way and helped you realize that it is indeed a beautiful day in the neighborhood. If you have not seen this movie, I urge you, take a moment, take your family, go out and see it. It is family friendly. And let me know what you think about it. I have not covered everything, but I've given you enough to get a perspective on what I thought of the movie. If I had to give it spotlights, I would give it 4 or 5 spotlights. It's hard to get a 5 or 5. But I would definitely give it 4 or 5 spotlights. It was a wonderful movie. It was brilliantly done, and Tom Hanks nailed the character. So please, when you have time, go out and see the movie. Let me know what you think. Share your comments respectfully, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Thank you.